The year was one reed. In the cyclical calendar of the Mexica, it was a year of prophecy, a time when the boundaries between the earth and the sky were dangerously thin. To the modern mind, the year is known as 1519, a date that marks the beginning of the end for a civilization that had built a garden in the middle of a lake. But for the people of Tenochtitlan, the end had already begun in the stars. The great speaker, Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, the ruler of the Aztec Empire, was not sleeping well. He was a man of profound intellect and deep piety, a former priest who had ascended to the throne of the greatest empire Mesoamerica had ever seen. He commanded armies that could crush rebellions in a week. He collected tribute from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Yet, in the quiet of his palace, surrounded by the scent of copal incense and the murmurs of his wives, he was terrified. 10 years before the catastrophe arrived, the signs had started. They were not subtle. A tongue of fire had appeared in the night sky, a pyramid of light that seemed to bleed onto the horizon every midnight, piercing the heavens like a wound. It was so bright that it turned the night into a sickly twilight. The scribes recorded it with trembling hands. Then, the temple of Huitzilopochtli, the war god, had burst into flames without a spark. When the priests threw water on the fire, it only burned hotter, consuming the wooden beams as if the water itself were fuel. A comet fell in broad daylight. The lake of Texcoco, usually calm as a mirror, boiled up in a sudden storm without wind, flooding the stone houses of the nobility. Moctezuma looked at these events not as weather, but as language. The gods were speaking, and the message was one of rupture. The legends of his people spoke of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, a god-king who had been driven away to the east long ago, promising to return in the year one reed to reclaim his kingdom. Moctezuma, a scholar of history, felt the weight of this coincidence pressing down on his chest. He was the ninth speaker, ruling at the height of his power, but he felt like a caretaker waiting for the landlord to return. He consulted his seers, his mirror gazers, and his astrologers. They gave him vague, comforting lies or terrified silences. He had some of them imprisoned, but you cannot imprison the future. The dread in Tenochtitlan was a physical thing, a heavy humidity that clung to the skin of the city. The empire was holding its breath. While Moctezuma watched the sky, a different kind of storm was gathering on the eastern horizon. It arrived not on the wind, but on wooden towers floating on the sea. Hernán Cortés had landed on the coast of Veracruz in April of 1519. He was 34 years old, a minor nobleman from Extremadura with a law degree he never used and an ambition that could not be contained by the narrow streets of Spain or the plantations of Cuba. He was a man of the Renaissance cunning, eloquent, ruthless, and deeply religious. But technically, he was also a criminal. Cortés had sailed from Cuba in defiance of the governor, Diego Velázquez. His orders were solely to explore and trade. He was explicitly forbidden to conquer or settle. But Cortés had no interest in trading glass beads for gold dust. He wanted an empire. When he landed on the dunes of San Juan de Ulloa with 500 men, 16 horses, and a few cannons, he knew that there was no going back. If he returned to Cuba, he would be thrown in chains for mutiny. His only path to legitimacy and to life lay forward into the unknown interior of a continent he barely understood. But his men were not so sure. They were a motley collection of adventurers, sailors, and mercenaries, many of whom were loyal to the governor of Cuba. They looked at the steaming jungle, the clouds of mosquitoes, and the rumors of bloodthirsty giants in the mountains, and they wanted to go home. Whispers of conspiracy began to circulate in the camp. A faction of the men planned to seize a ship and sail back to Havana to report Cortés' treason. Cortés moved with the decisive violence that would define his entire campaign. He identified the ringleaders and had 2 of them hanged. The pilot who had conspired with them had his feet cut off, but fear was not enough to bind the army to his will. He needed necessity. In a stroke of theatrical genius that rivals any moment in military history, Cortés ordered his own fleet to be destroyed. He did not burn them, as the popular myth suggests, he scuttled them. He ordered the pilots to bore holes in the hulls, claiming the ships were worm-eaten and unseaworthy. The men watched from the beach as their only ticket home filled with water and settled into the sand of the bay. The psychological impact was absolute. There was no Cuba anymore. There was no Spain. There was only the beach, the mountains, and the city of gold that lay somewhere in the west. Cortes turned to his terrified, angry army and offered them a simple choice. They could die here on the coast as failures, or they could march with him to Tenochtitlan and become kings. He had manufactured a situation where courage was the only rational option. The Iron Men, as the indigenous locals called them, tightened their armor, shouldered their crossbows, and turned their backs on the sea. The invasion had begun. The road to Tenochtitlan was not a highway. It was a gauntlet. Between the coast and the capital lay 200 miles of the most difficult terrain in the Americas. The Spanish column had to climb from the humid, fever-ridden tropics of the coast up to the freezing, thin air of the high plateau, 7,000 feet above sea level. They dragged their cannons through mud and over precipices. The men slept in their armor, rusting in the rain, always watching the tree line for an ambush. But the physical challenge was nothing compared to the political minefield they were entering. Cortes, for all his ruthlessness, was a brilliant diplomat. He quickly realized that the Aztec Empire was not a monolith. It was a patchwork of conquered peoples who hated their masters in Tenochtitlan. The Aztecs ruled through fear and tribute. They demanded cotton, jade, feathers, and, most crucially, human beings for sacrifice. The resentment against Moctezuma was a powder keg waiting for a spark, and Cortes was holding the match. His first major encounter was with the Tlaxcalans, a fiercely independent people who had been fighting the Aztecs for generations. Tlaxcala was a republic, completely surrounded by Aztec territory, surviving only through the ferocity of its warriors. When the Spanish entered Tlaxcalan territory, they were not greeted as liberators. They were attacked. For days, the Tlaxcalans threw wave after wave of warriors against the small Spanish force. The Spanish survived only because of their technology, the steel swords that could cut through cotton armor, the terrifying noise of the arquebuses, and the shock of the cavalry. To the Tlaxcalans, the horse and rider appeared as a single, monstrous beast. But the battles were desperate. Cortes later wrote that he barely slept, expecting to be overrun every night. Yet, after realizing they could not crush the Iron Men, the Tlaxcalan lords changed tactics. They saw an opportunity. If these strangers could kill Aztecs, they were valuable. The war turned into an alliance. 6,000 Tlaxcalan warriors joined Cortes. The invasion force just multiplied by 12. The combined army now marched toward Cholula, the second largest city in the empire and a sacred center of the god Quetzalcoatl. Cholula was a city of pyramids, a place of pilgrimage and trade, allied with Moctezuma. The Spanish arrived and were welcomed into the city, but the atmosphere was thick with paranoia. The Tlaxcalans warned Cortes that the Cholulans were planning a trap. They pointed to holes dug in the streets to trip the horses and piles of stones on the rooftops. A local woman, the wife of a Cholulan noble, allegedly tipped off Cortes' translator and mistress Malinche that an Aztec army was waiting nearby to slaughter them in their sleep. Cortes decided to strike first. He summoned the nobles and chiefs of Cholula to the great courtyard of the temple, ostensibly to say farewell before marching on. Thousands of unarmed men gathered, curious and unsuspecting. Cortes, mounted on his horse, accused them of treason. Before they could answer, he dropped his hand. The arquebuses fired into the crowd. What followed was not a battle. It was a butchery. The Spanish blocked the exits and unleashed their steel. The Tlaxcalans, fueled by decades of hatred, rampaged through the city, settling old scores with horrific violence. In a few hours, thousands of Cholulans lay dead in the plaza. The temples were looted and burned. The message was sent, loud and clear, to every city in the valley. The Spanish rules of war were different. They did not fight to capture prisoners for sacrifice. they fought to exterminate. The massacre at Cholula broke the psychological resistance of the region. Moctezuma, hearing the news in his palace, went into a deep depression. The gods had failed to protect their own holy city. These strangers could slaughter a town in an afternoon and sleep soundly that night. The road to Tenochtitlan was now open. There were no more armies to stop them. The only thing left was the meeting between the man who thought he was a god and the man who knew he was a wolf. On the 8th of November, 1519, the Spanish army reached the edge of the lake. They stood on the Iztapalapa Causeway, a marvel of engineering that stretched for miles across the water, straight as a spear shaft. To the eyes of the Europeans, accustomed to the cramped, winding, filthy streets of medieval Spain, what they saw was hallucinatory. They saw a city of 200,000 people floating on the water like a dream. It was larger than Seville, larger than Paris, larger than Rome. It was a grid of canals and white stucco palaces that gleamed in the high-altitude sun so brightly that it hurt the eyes to look at them. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, a soldier who was there, wrote that many of the men asked if they were sleeping. If they were inside a legend from the Book of Amadis de Gaula, they were looking at the Venice of the New World, a metropolis of order and beauty built by a civilization they had dismissed as savages. The causeway was wide enough for 8 horsemen to ride abreast. As they marched along it, thousands of canoes flocked to the sides of the road, the people of the lake staring up in silence at the toils, the gods, or perhaps the demons. The clatter of the horses' hooves on the stone pavement was the only sound. At the gates of the city, the procession stopped. The nobility of Tenochtitlan came forward, dressed in capes of hummingbird feathers and turquoise, sweeping the ground before the litter of their lord. And then Moctezuma too stepped down. He was a man of about 40, slender and dignified, wearing sandals with solace of gold. He was supported by his nephews, the lords of Texcoco and Iztapalapa. No commoner was allowed to look him in the face. To do so was death. But courts, ignorant or indifferent to the protocol, dismounted and stepped forward to embrace him. The Aztec lords held him back, shocked by the audacity. It was a collision of cosmologies. One man was the living embodiment of the sun. The other was a lawyer from Extremadura looking for a payday. Courts placed a necklace of glass beads, cheap Venetian trinkets, around the emperor's neck. In return, Moctezuma gave him 2 necklaces of red snail shells, from which hung 8 golden shrimps. They exchanged words through Malinche, the indigenous translator who stood between the 2 worlds. Moctezuma's welcome speech has been debated for centuries. In the Spanish accounts, he supposedly surrendered his empire immediately, claiming that his ancestors had been waiting for the Spanish to return. This is almost certainly a fabrication, a legal fiction invented by courts to justify his coup to the King of Spain. More likely, Moctezuma was performing a ritual of polite hospitality, welcoming a high-status guest with the flowery, self-deprecating language of the Aztec court. He offered them the palace of his father, Axayacatl, as a guest house. He thought he was managing a diplomatic crisis. He did not know he was inviting the plague into his bedroom. For a week, the city existed in a surreal state of suspension. The Spanish toured the great market of Tlatelolco, marveling at the abundance of food, the order of the stalls, and the sheer volume of commerce. They climbed the steps of the Templo Mayor and saw the rack of skulls, the Tzompantli, and the fresh blood on the altar where hearts were offered to Huitzilopochtli. They were terrified. They were 500 men in a city of warriors. They knew that if Moctezuma gave the order, the bridges would be raised, and they would be trapped and sacrificed. Courts decided to act with the reckless gamble that was his trademark. He realized that the only thing keeping the city paralyzed was the sacred authority of the emperor. If he controlled the body of Moctezuma, he controlled the empire. On November 14th, courts marched into the royal palace with his captains and 30 armed men. The pretense of friendship evaporated. He accused Moctezuma of ordering an attack on the Spanish garrison back on the coast, a convenient excuse, and demanded that the emperor come with them to the Spanish quarters. Moctezuma was stunned. He offered gold. He offered his children as hostages. He offered anything to avoid the shame of imprisonment. But the Iron Men were immovable. "Why do we waste words?" shouted one of the captains. "Let us take him or stab him." Faced with the cold steel of the swords, the Lord of the Earth crumbled. He called for his litter and allowed himself to be carried out of his own palace, through the weeping crowds of his subjects, into the custody of the strangers. It was a coup d'etat achieved without a drop of blood in the capital. For the next 6 months, Moctezuma lived as a puppet king. He ruled his empire from a room in the Spanish barracks. He continued to collect tribute, to judge disputes, and to oversee the rituals, but always with a Spanish guard at his door. He played a board game called Totologue with courts, joking and laughing with his captor, developing a strange case of Stockholm Syndrome. He even showed courts the locations of the gold mines. To his people, he began to look less like a god and more like a collaborator. The spell of his divinity was breaking. The tension in the city was rising like the water level of the lake before a storm. The Venice of the New World was about to become a slaughterhouse. In May of 1520, the fragile equilibrium of the occupation was shattered. News arrived from the coast that a Spanish fleet had anchored at Veracruz. It was not a reinforcement. It was a punitive expedition. The governor of Cuba had sent Panfilo de Narvaez with 900 men to arrest Hernan Cortes and hang him for treason. Cortes, faced with enemies in front of him and enemies behind him, made a decision that would doom the city. He took his best soldiers and marched back to the coast to fight his countrymen, leaving the garrison in Tenochtitlan under the command of his lieutenant, Pedro de Alvarado. It was a fatal choice. If Cortes was the scalpel, Alvarado was the hammer. He was a man of immense physical courage and stunning brutality, known to the Aztecs as Tenacia, or the Sun, because of his height and his golden blonde hair. But he possessed none of his commander's subtlety. Left alone in a city of 200,000 people who were growing increasingly hostile, Alvarado began to panic. He saw conspiracies in every shadow. When the Aztec nobility asked for permission to celebrate the festival of Tenochtitlan, a sacred dance in honor of Huitzilopochtli, Alvarado agreed, but his mind was already racing with paranoia. He believed the dance was a prelude to an uprising. He decided to decapitate the rebellion before it could be born. On the day of the festival, the great temple precinct was filled with the flower of Aztec chivalry. The highest-ranking nobles, the fiercest jaguar and eagle warriors, and the most learned priests were gathered in the courtyard. They were unarmed, dressed only in their ceremonial finery feathers, bells, and jade. They danced to the rhythm of the wooden drums, a hypnotic circular movement that was a prayer in motion. Alvarado watched them from the edges, his men gripping their swords. Then he gave the signal. The Spaniards blocked the 4 exits of the walled courtyard. What followed was not a battle, but an abattoir. The Spanish waded into the mass of dancers, hacking at limbs and faces. The Iron Men severed the hands of the drummers. They disemboweled the priests. The courtyard, polished to a shine, became slippery with blood. Within an hour, thousands of the empire's ruling class were dead. The head of the Aztec snake had been cut off, but Alvarado had miscalculated. He thought that by killing the leaders, he would terrify the population into submission. Instead, he enraged them. The city did not cower. It exploded. The populace, hearing the screams from the temple, rushed the palace. They penned the Spanish inside the walls of Axel's palace, cutting off the food and water. The illusion of the gods was gone. These were just murderers, and they were trapped. Cortes returned in late June, having performed another miracle on the coast. He had defeated Narvaez not by battle, but by bribery, convincing the newcomer's army to switch sides. He marched back to the capital with a reinforced army of over 1,000 Spaniards. But as he crossed the causeways, the silence of the city was terrifying. No canoes greeted him. The bridges were empty. He marched into the palace to find Alvarado besieged and the city waiting for the kill. Cortes was furious with his lieutenant, but there was no time for recriminations. The Aztecs had raised the bridges. The Spanish were rats in a trap. In a desperate bid to quell the insurrection, Cortes played his final card, Moctezuma. He ordered the emperor to go out onto the roof of the palace and order his people to lay down their arms. It was a tragic, humiliating end for the Lord of the Earth. Moctezuma stepped out onto the parapet, dressed in his imperial robes, but the awe he once commanded had turned to hatred. His people no longer saw him as a god. They saw him as a collaborator, a woman, a traitor who had sold them to the strangers. A young warrior in the crowd, perhaps Cuitlahuac, the emperor's brother who had taken command of the resistance, shouted insults. Then the stones began to fly. The Spanish shields were slow to cover the emperor. A rock struck Moctezuma on the head. He fell, unconscious, and was carried back inside. The accounts of what happened next diverge into two irreconcilable histories. The Spanish claim that Moctezuma died of his wounds a few days later, refusing all medical aid, heartbroken by his people's rejection. The Aztec accounts, recorded later in the Florentine Codex, tell a darker story. They claim that once Moctezuma was no longer useful as a hostage, once his voice failed to stop the attacks, Cortes had him murdered. They say the Spanish stabbed him in the darkness of the palace and tossed his body into the canals like garbage. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. The shield was gone. On the night of June the 30th, 1520, the situation inside the palace was terminal. There was no food. The water was gone. The Aztec attacks were becoming more ferocious, threatening to breach the walls. The pyramid of fire in the sky had been a true omen after all. Cortes made the decision to evacuate. They would leave that very night, under the cover of a rainstorm and the new moon. But before they left, the curse of the conquest revealed itself: greed. In the center of the palace lay the king's fifth, a massive pile of gold bars, melted down from the ornaments of the temples. It was too heavy to carry. Cortes took the royal share for the King of Spain and loaded it onto a mare and several Tlaxcalan porters. Then he looked at the rest of the gold, a mountain of wealth gleaming in the torchlight, and told his soldiers to take what they wanted. He who takes the most, he warned them, travels the slowest. The veterans, the men who had been with Cortes from the start, took only a few light pieces. But the newcomers, the men from Narvaez's army, who had marched up from the coast, dreaming of riches, lost their minds. They stuffed gold bars into their doublets, their greaves, and their pockets. They wrapped gold chains around their waists until they could barely walk. They were weighed down by their own avarice, transforming themselves into drowning men before they even touched the water. At midnight, the column moved out. They headed for the Tlacopan Causeway, the shortest route to the mainland. It was raining hard, a cold, miserable downpour that obscured the moon. They moved in silence, their horses' hooves wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound. They carried a portable wooden bridge, designed to span the gaps in the causeway where the Aztecs had removed the permanent bridges. They reached the first gap. They laid the bridge. The vanguard crossed. It seemed the god of thieves was with them. But then, a woman drawing water at the edge of the canal saw them. She screamed. High above, on the great temple, the priests heard her. The great drum of Huitzilopochtli, made of snakeskin, began to beat, a deep, mournful throb that echoed across the lake. Suddenly, the water came alive. The lake, which had been black and empty, was instantly filled with thousands of canoes. The Aztecs did not attack from the front. They attacked from the sides. They swarmed the causeway, stabbing up with long spears, dragging the soldiers into the water. The Spanish formation disintegrated into a panicked stampede. The portable bridge, the key to their survival, was the first casualty. The weight of the horses and the gold-laden men drove it deep into the mud of the lakebed. When they tried to lift it to move to the second gap, it would not budge. It was stuck fast. The army was trapped on a ribbon of stone with open water in front of them and a wall of warriors behind them. The Night of Sorrows, La Noche Triste, had begun. The second gap in the causeway became a scene of horror that defies description. The Spanish were forced to swim. The veterans threw away their armor and swam for their lives. The new recruits, heavy with the gold of the Aztecs, sank like stones. The canal was filled with men and horses, screaming as they drowned or were dragged onto the canoes to be sacrificed. The water turned red. Eventually, the gap was filled not with a bridge, but with bodies. The rear guard crossed over the corpses of their comrades. Alvarado, commanding the rear, found himself cut off. Legend says he used his lance to vault across a massive breach in the causeway, Alvarado's Leap, abandoning his men to save his own skin. He arrived on the mainland bleeding and breathless, finding Cortes weeping under a cypress tree. As the sun rose on the 1st of July, the magnitude of the disaster was revealed. 2/3 of the Spanish army was dead. 4,000 Tlaxcalan allies had perished. All the cannons were lost. All the gunpowder was wet. And at the bottom of the lake, resting in the mud among the bones of the greedy, lay the treasure of Moctezuma. Cortes sat under the tree, his head in his hands, watching the remnants of his ambition limp out of the mist. He had conquered the empire, and in one night he had lost it all. But as he looked at the smoking city in the distance, the sorrow in his heart began to harden into something colder. He was not leaving. He was going to build ships. The Spanish army that limped away from Tenochtitlan was a broken thing. Wounded, starving, and demoralized, they were chased across the plains of Otumba by the victorious Aztec forces. They survived only by a miracle of desperate cavalry tactics, killing the Aztec general and seizing the battle standard, which caused the enemy host to scatter. They retreated to the safety of Tlaxcala, the only place in the valley where they were not hunted. There, Cortes collapsed. He had lost fingers on his left hand. His head had been cut open by sling stones. For weeks, he lay in a fever, hovering between life and death. But while the Iron Men licked their wounds in the mountains, a new combatant entered the war. It was a soldier that needed no armor, ate no food, and slept in no bed. It had arrived with Narvaez's fleet on the coast carried, the chronicles say, by an enslaved African named Francisco Ijua. It was the variola virus, smallpox. In the isolation of the Americas, the indigenous immune system had never encountered the disease. There was no genetic memory of it, no resistance. As the Aztecs celebrated their victory and cleaned the blood from their temples, the virus began its work. It started with a fever, then a headache, then the great rash. Pustules covered the body, face, and inside of the throat. The victims could not move. They could not eat. They died of dehydration and starvation as much as from the virus itself, because there was no one left standing to bring them water. The epidemic that hit Tenochtitlan in the autumn of 1520 was apocalyptic. It killed Cuauhtlawak, the hero of the Noche Triste, who had succeeded Moctezuma. He had ruled for only 80 days. It killed the priests who knew the rituals. It killed the generals who knew the tactics. It killed the farmers who planted the maize. In the space of 60 days, nearly 40% of the population of central Mexico died. The streets of Tenochtitlan, once so clean that a man could walk in his bare feet without getting them dirty, were piled with corpses. The silence that fell over the city was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a graveyard. The Aztecs called it Huicahuatl, the Great Leprosy. It broke the chain of command and shattered the spiritual confidence of the people. How could the gods allow this? Why did the strangers not die? While the invisible army decimated his enemy, Cortes was building a visible one. He had learned the lesson of the Noche Triste. Tenochtitlan could not be taken by land. The causeways were death traps. To take the city, he had to control the lake. He needed a navy. In a feat of logistical genius that rivals the crossing of the Alps by Hannibal, Cortes ordered the construction of 13 brigantine small, swift warships equipped with sails and oars. But he was in Tlaxcala, over 100 miles from the lake, on the other side of a mountain range. He decided to build the ships in sections. He employed the master shipwright Martin Lopez to design them. Thousands of Tlaxcalan laborers felled the trees, sawed the planks, and forged the iron nails, using metal salvaged from the scuttled ships at Veracruz. Once the pieces were ready, a procession unlike anything the New World had ever seen began. 8,000 Tlaxcalan porters carried the dismantled fleet on their backs. They marched in a column that stretched for 6 miles, guarded by 20,000 warriors. They carried the masts, the rudders, the sails, and the cordage up the steep mountain passes and down into the Valley of Mexico. It was a moving shipyard. When they reached the shores of Lake Texcoco, they assembled the ships in a canal dug specifically for the launch. Cortes had also replenished his manpower. Ships from Jamaica and Cuba had arrived at the coast, bringing fresh horses, gunpowder, and men who were unaware of the disaster of the previous year. Cortes now commanded a force of 900 Spaniards and, crucially, nearly 100,000 indigenous allies. The Tlaxcalans, the Texcocans, and other subject tribes sensed the changing wind. They saw the weakness of the Aztecs caused by the plague, and they joined the Spanish to overthrow their oppressors. On April 28, 1521, the ships were launched. The wind filled the sails. The cannons were loaded. Cortes stood on the deck of his flagship, looking across the water at the island city. He was not coming back to negotiate. He was not coming back to trade. He was coming to erase. He issued his orders. Cut the aqueducts that brought fresh water from Chapultepec. Blockade the causeways to stop food from entering. Tenochtitlan, the garden of the world, was to be starved, choked, and battered until it surrendered or ceased to exist. The siege had begun. The siege of Tenochtitlan, which began in late May of 1521, was not a battle. It was an excavation of humanity. It lasted for 93 days. It was a collision between the immovable object of Aztec fanaticism and the irresistible force of Spanish desperation. Cortes knew he could not simply storm the city. The urban density of Tenochtitlan was a fortress in itself. Every canal was a moat, every bridge a drawbridge, every rooftop a tower. The new emperor, Cuauhtémoc, a cousin of Moctezuma, whose name meant descending eagle, was a warrior of terrifying resolve. He was 18 years old. He knew there would be no negotiation. He ordered the bridges raised, the dikes pierced, and the population mobilized for total war. The Spanish strategy was a tightening noose. They controlled the lake with their 13 brigantines. These water houses were the decisive weapon. They could smash through the fleets of Aztec canoes, their cannons firing canister shot that turned the water into a slurry of wood and bone. They cut the supply lines. No corn, no beans, no salt could enter the city, and most devastatingly, no water. The aqueduct at Chapultepec had been smashed in the first days of the siege. The people of the island were forced to drink the brackish, salty water of the lake, which was slowly filling with the bodies of the dead. But the advance on the causeways was a meat grinder. The Spanish would fight their way forward during the day, capturing a bridge or a barricade, only to be forced back at night. The Aztecs fought with a ferocity that stunned the veterans of the Italian wars. They captured Spanish soldiers alive, dragging them away into the smoke of the city. From their camps on the mainland, the Spanish could look up at the Great Temple and see their comrades being forced up the steps, stripped naked, and stretched over the sacrificial stone. They watched as the priests cut out their hearts and offered them to Huitzilopochtli, then kicked the bodies down the stairs to be butchered. The sound of the great snakeskin drum haunted their sleep. It was psychological warfare of the highest order. The stalemate lasted for weeks. The Tlaxcalan allies, numbering in the tens of thousands, clamored for blood. They wanted to burn the city to the waterline. Cortes, who had once dreamed of ruling this city as a jewel of the Spanish crown, finally accepted the grim logic of the situation. He could not conquer Tenochtitlan. He had to destroy it. He issued the order: demolition. The strategy shifted from capture to erasure. Every day, the army advanced, and behind them, a labor force of indigenous allies pulled down the buildings. They filled the canals with the rubble of the palaces. They turned the Venice of the New World into a flat, dusty plain. The armed men advanced over the graves of the architecture they had once admired. It was a slow, agonizing constriction. The defending perimeter shrank day by day. The Aztecs were pushed from the center of Tenochtitlan into the market district of Tlatelolco, the last stronghold. By August, the conditions inside the city were dantesque. The Florentine Codex describes the horror. We ate lizards, swallows, corncobs, and the salt grass of the lake. We ate adobe bricks. The people were skeletal. Smallpox and dysentery raged in the cramped quarters. The smell of rotting corpses was so overpowering that even the Spanish, hardened by months of war, retched as they advanced. Yet, Cuauhtémoc refused to surrender. When courts sent envoys offering terms, Cuauhtémoc sacrificed them. "It is better to die fighting," he told his council, "than to be a slave to the strangers." The final assault began on the 12th of August. The Spanish and their allies broke into Tlatelolco. It was a massacre. The Tlaxcalans, finally unleashed upon their hated oppressors, spared no one. Women, children, and the elderly were slaughtered in the streets. The water of the canals was so thick with blood that it reportedly ran red for hours. The Aztec warriors, too weak to lift their obsidian swords, fought with stones and their bare hands. On the 13th of August, the day of St. Hippolytus, the end arrived. Cuauhtémoc, realizing that the city was a tomb, tried to escape in a canoe with his family, perhaps to organize a guerrilla war in the mountains. He was spotted by a Spanish brigantine commanded by Garcia Holguin. The cannons were aimed. The arquebuses were leveled. The descending eagle stood up and surrendered. He was brought before courts, who had set up a canopy on a rooftop overlooking the devastation. Cuauhtémoc was covered in the dust of battle, his feathers torn, his face gaunt from hunger. He reached for the dagger in Cortes' belt. "I have done everything I could to defend my people," he said. "I am now your prisoner. Take that dagger and kill me now." Cortes, ever the politician, refused. He embraced the young emperor, praising his bravery. But the gesture was hollow. The fifth sun had set. The Aztec Empire was dead. The silence that fell over the lake that evening was heavier than the roar of the cannons. The great drum was silent. The screaming had stopped. And then, the rain began to fall, a torrential downpour that washed the blood from the stones of the ruined plaza. The aftermath was a plunder of the soul. The Spanish searched frantically for the lost gold of the Tenochtitlan. They tortured Cuauhtémoc, burning his feet with oil to make him talk, but the treasure was never fully recovered. Most of it remains lost to history, perhaps buried in the mud of the lake or hidden in a cave in the north. But the true treasure was the land itself. Cortes ordered the city to be rebuilt immediately. He did not move the capital to the mainland. He built it right on top of the ruins. The stones of the great temple were dismantled and used to build the Cathedral of Mexico City. The palace of Moctezuma became the palace of the viceroy. The lake was slowly drained, turning the island into a part of the mainland, burying the canals under asphalt and cobblestones. The fall of Tenochtitlan was the birth trauma of the modern world. It was the moment when the globe truly became connected, when the biology, economy, and faith of Europe collided violently with the Americas. It created a new race, the mestizo, born of the blood of the conqueror and the conquered. It was a destruction so total that it seems almost mythical. It was acted out by men who breathed, bled, and wrote it all down. Today, if you walk through the Zocalo in Mexico City, you are walking on top of the Aztec world. Beneath the pavement lie the foundations of the pyramids and the bones of the defenders. Every few years, construction workers digging a subway line or a basement unearth a stone serpent or a sacrificial knife, a reminder that the fifth sun may have set, but the night is still long. The gods of the lake are sleeping beneath the concrete, waiting perhaps for the wheel of time to turn once more.